Vyacheslav Solovyov was born on the 12th of March, 1970 in Yaroslavl. He grew up in a full family. His father and mother were ordinary hard workers. As a child, the boy was no different from his peers. In 1988, he joined the army and got into the Dzerzhinsky division of the internal troops, where he received a serious traumatic brain injury after falling from a tower. After that, the young man began to have outbursts of uncontrollable anger. According to some reports, while in the hospital, Solovyov strangled a neighbor in the ward with a pillow after quarrels, but this story got away with it. The matter was hushed up. After returning home, Vyacheslav got married. He met his future wife Olga, who waited for him from the army, back in high school. A young family settled in a 3-room apartment on Leningradsky Prospect, which was given to the young by Olga's stepfather. In the 89th year, their daughter Nastia was born. "I love you very much. I have no one but you. I understand that words are not enough to prove my love. Things need to be done," Vyacheslav wrote to his wife when she was in the hospital. Solovyov's wife was a housewife, engaged in flower breeding, took her daughter to art school and took care of her husband, who was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Vyacheslav earned good money. After studying at the local Polytechnic Institute for a short time, he dropped out and opened his own company. In the 2002 year, Solovyov watched the film The Young Poisoner's Handbook, dedicated to the life of serial killer Graham Young, and then read Agatha Christie's detective story Villa White Horse, which described poisoning by Talia. These stories fascinated Vyacheslav so much that he decided to experiment with poisons. At one of the local enterprises,
"Hey, I'm not going to beat around the bush. You have to subscribe to the channel and like it so you don't miss new videos."
Poisoning by Talia. These stories fascinated Vyacheslav so much that he decided to experiment with poisons. At one of the local enterprises, Solovyov bought various drugs, including 400 grams of thallium sulfate, for which he paid 2,500 rubles. Having studied the recipe libraries of deadly mixtures, Vyacheslav produced 4 types of poison. First, he tested the poison on himself, each time escaping with a pre-prepared antidote. Then the Solovyov's cat became the test subject. The animal, to which the experimenter poured the powder into a bowl with food, soon died. The poisoner did not stop at the cat. After another quarrel with his wife, who, as Vyacheslav would later say, he was tired of, he began to add poison to her food. After a piece of fried fish, which Solovyov stuffed with poison, Olga became ill. She was hospitalized. But then the portion of poison seemed small, and the woman survived. But Vyacheslav did not stop there either and continued to poison his wife for several months. Olga was rapidly losing weight, but attributed it to sports and the effect of acupuncture. However, in December of the 2003 year, her condition deteriorated sharply. She fell into a coma and soon died, despite all the efforts of doctors. Pathologists could not establish the exact cause of death. The autopsy showed that the deceased's liver and kidneys had failed. Some time after the death of his wife, Vyacheslav outlined a new victim, Mikhail's neighbor. Solovyov hated him for his excessive addiction to alcoholic beverages. Mikhail sometimes got drunk and went to bed in the common vestibule, preventing a neighbor from getting home. The last straw for Solovyov was the loss of a car battery, which he carelessly left at the front door. The poisoner blamed the theft on an alcoholic neighbor and began to prepare revenge. One day he invited Mikhail to visit, bought vodka and cooked red caviar with poison. The maniac knew that the neighbor would not refuse a sandwich with a delicacy. But Mikhail suddenly went on a binge and disappeared for several days. Solovyov had to hide the poisoned caviar in the refrigerator. When he left for work, part of the caviar was eaten by his daughter, 14-year-old Nastia. On the same day, she was admitted to the hospital. The girl's condition worsened every day. Her hair fell out and her leg began to be taken away. Doctors conducted a lot of research and took all kinds of tests from the patient, but they could not determine the cause of her illness. The father did not even try to save his daughter and did not tell about the poison. "That's why I didn't tell the doctors to Iota. It was my weakness, cowardice. I was afraid of my exposure in the poisoning of my wife," Vyacheslav Solovyov confessed during the interrogation. After suffering for several months, Nastia died in August of the 2004 year. Solovyov told the neighbors that the girl did not survive the death of her mother and committed suicide. Soon after, Vyacheslav closed his company, sold his apartment and moved to a new friend who was engaged in trading at the local market and lived on Uritsky Street. Solovyov was helped to get a job by his father, who held a position at an oil refinery. Thanks to his connections, he attached Vyacheslav as a supply engineer to a construction company. In his new place, Vyacheslav began to poison his colleagues on the sly. He poured poison into a carafe of water that stood in his office, and then watched as colleagues complained of nausea, abdominal pain, and hair loss. They were frightened and sinned at traces of heavy metals on the territory of the enterprise, but the examination conducted by the invited specialists did not confirm this version. One of Solovyov's colleagues was less fortunate than others. He was hospitalized several times and his legs failed. And then the turn came to the new chosen one of the poisoner. 6 months after the start of their life together, Irina began to annoy him. In April of the 25th year, he slipped poison into the coffee of his concubine. I didn't want to kill her, I just wanted to scare her. That is, to make her feel bad, and that's it. After the first time, she did not succumb to my provocations with her state of health, and the second time I decided to apply more, and it turned out that this led her to her deathbed, Vyacheslav Solovyov admitted later. After the second dose of poison, Irina died. The killer informed the doctors that the cause of death was encephalitis. Allegedly, shortly before her death, Irina was bitten by a tick. For some reason Solovyov's doctors believed him, but his father suspected something was wrong and shared his terrible guesses with the staff of the prosecutor's office. However, they did not take the words of Solovyov Sr. seriously. If Slava had been detained in the 2005 year, after my first appeal, how many lives would it have saved? Valery Solovyov told the media. After learning about this, Vyacheslav began to threaten the parent and said that he had come to the very edge of the abyss. But the father still tried to warn Solovyov's new lover, acrobatics coach Oksana, with whom he met in the autumn of 2006 year. But a woman who raised 2 young daughters alone and was insanely glad to see a man in the house, only waved off a relative with his suspicions. The poisoner of Svidu was an exemplary family man. He drove his common-law wife to sports camps by car, and at that time he took care of his stepdaughters. However, over time, he began to feel hatred for the new chosen one. However, before he dealt with Oksana, Solovyov managed to poison an employee of the Dzerzhinsk police department, Captain Vyacheslav Sherbakov. Solovyov came to him for questioning in August of the 2006 year in the case of a mass brawl that occurred in February of the same year in one of the city cafes. During the conflict, the poisoner stabbed his abuser with a knife, and during the interrogation, Captain Sherbakov tried to find out who was the instigator of that fight. But Solovyov really did not like the intensity with which the investigator conducted the conversation. Having received a moment when Sherbakov was distracted, Solovyov slipped poison into his coffee cup. Later, from the same mug, I drank coffee on the guy for Sherbakov. Despite the fact that the woman was tormented for a long time by attacks of palpitations and dizziness, she survived. And the captain didn't live long. In August of the 26th year, he died of pulmonary artery thrombosis caused by poisoning. As for Solovyov, he was eventually found guilty in the stabbing case, but he got off with a suspended sentence. Having poisoned the captain, Solovyov decided to deal with another mistress. When they went together to visit Oksana's grandmother, who lived in the village of Krasny Profintern, he mixed the powder into a decanter with Morse. After drinking it, Oksana fell ill, thinking that she had the flu, but thanks to her good health she survived. And for her grandmother, the poisoned Morse became a sentence. She died. In March of the 2007 year, the poisoner began to poison the neighbors in the apartment, Oksana's sister Natalia, her husband Eugene and 1-year-old son Sasha. Solovyov mixed poison into a jar of water, from which the whole family, including the baby, drank. Sasha was the first to get to the hospital. He suddenly began to fall, wheezing and choking. The frightened parents called an ambulance, and the boy was urgently taken to the intensive care unit. Doctors fought all night for the child's life, but they could not save him. Sasha, who was destined to become the last victim of Solovyov, died in the morning. And a couple of days later, Natalia Evgenia was delivered to the clinic right from her son's funeral. They started vomiting and had a fever. At the beginning, the doctors diagnosed both with pneumonia, but the treatment did not help. The spouses were getting worse. Yaroslavl doctors did not have good laboratories for complex analyses, and they decided to seek help from specialists from St. Petersburg. Toxicologists from the northern capital were immediately alerted by the symptoms of a strange disease that struck Natalia Evgenia. Both of them had their hair falling out in clumps. Special tests have shown the presence of a large amount of Talia in the body of both. When the tests were brought, the doctor's hair stood on end. They said that my dose is more than 10 times higher than the lethal one. It's unclear how I live and still do. My blood was drained, plasma was pumped out, saline was poured in. This is a kind of cleaning. Plasmapheresis is called. When the doctor drained the plasma for the first time, I saw him shudder himself. He began to shake. He showed the plasma. She was black, Yevgeny later told one of the newspapers. Realizing what was the matter, the doctors immediately began to treat poisoning, and the couple went on the mend, but Eugene remained disabled for life. After being discharged from the hospital, they applied to the local Department of Internal Affairs. Having studied the family's closest circle of acquaintances, the investigators finally turned their attention to Solovyov. There were too many suspicious deaths around him. Having examined the man's workplace, the detectives secretly found a strange computer disk in the desk drawer. It turned out that at his leisure Solovyov studied how to turn a person into a zombie. He kept at work a CD with a film about the poisoner Graham Young, as well as printed footage from this movie. Vyacheslav was followed, and soon the police saw him heading to the abandoned warehouses on the territory of his company, near which he had been digging in the ground for some time. After waiting for Solovyov to return to his workplace, the detectives examined the place where he came and found a strange vial of white powder there. Part of the substance was taken for examination, which confirmed that there was a poison based on Talia in the vial. In May of the 27th year, a 37-year-old maniac was detained at the moment when he was digging up a vial. By the way, a few days before that, Solovyov found himself in the center of a scandal in his own company. A surveillance camera recorded him spraying a gas canister in the toilet. Investigators decided to exhume all the victims associated with the poisoner during their lifetime, and forensic experts found Talia in all the remains. However, Solovyov did not deny his involvement in the poisoning. During interrogations, he enthusiastically, sometimes for half a day, told about the circumstances of the death of each of his 6 victims. The poisoner said that every year he visited the graves of the women he poisoned. At first he kept silent only about the case with investigator Sherbakov, but then confessed to this. The psychological and psychiatric examination found Solovyov sane. However, after the first court session, the maniac tried to take his own life right in the courthouse. They managed to save him, but after that there was a break in the case. At first, the defendant underwent the prescribed treatment, and then specialists conducted another examination. But this time the verdict of the psychiatrists remained the same. Solovyov is sane. This decision quite satisfied the defendant. Unlike most maniacs who dreamed of going to a psychiatric clinic instead of cameras, the poisoner did not want to get forced treatment. After reviewing the arguments of the investigation, the father of the maniac actually abandoned his son, cursed him and demanded severe punishment for him. And Solovyov's mother, who until recently did not believe in her son's involvement in the deaths of Olga and Nastia, went to court sessions and was present at the last word of the poisoner. Solovyov carefully prepared for the final performance and wrote down the speech in a notebook. The maniac did not apologize to the relatives of the victims and only complained about his health, disability of the second group, hepatitis, and hypertension. He also noted that he voluntarily confessed to all crimes and asked not to punish him too harshly. They want to give me the maximum punishment, but we don't live in the Middle Ages, when the Inquisition rules everything, Vyacheslav Solovyov said at the trial. However, the court was not impressed by the defendant's monologue. The maniac was appointed for life with a payment in favor of the relatives of the victims of about 1 million rubles. However, Solovyov never reached the colony of special regime. In December of the 2008 year, the poisoner died in a solitary cell of the Yaroslavl pretrial detention center. The reason was phlegmon-purulent inflammation of subcutaneous tissues, which, against the background of diabetes mellitus, proved fatal for the convict. It is also possible that experiments with poisons, which Solovyov conducted on himself, played a role. I unwittingly became his confessor myself. Before his death, Solovyov opened his soul to me. He confessed that he was being dragged to the next world by the souls of the children he had poisoned. Dying, he said that he was to blame for their death and that this villainy would not be in vain for him. God will punish. He begged me to invite a priest into the cell to repent of his sins. However, I didn't have time. He started vomiting, and he fell into a coma, told an employee of the Yaroslavl pre-trial detention center about the death of the maniac poisoner Vyacheslav Solovyov.